Hey everyone, Joshua Gibson here, and you're listening to episode 36 of the Philosophical Weightlifting podcast. And we are live. I am joined today by Chris Tabor. Chris, how you doing?
I'm well. How are you today?
Doing pretty well. And this is a little bit of a change of pace. Normally we have on like a really high level weightlifter, but now we have on a really intelligent guy who got his PhD from ETSU in sport physiology, which is, they teach you there to coach athletes or how to coach athletes and improve athletic performance. So that's a bit removed from the normal exercise science kind of course of things. So Chris, if you could give us a bit of information about your background, because you are a weightlifting coach as well as a professor, which is an interesting combination. So if you can kind of get us to this point, I'm sure everyone would love to hear that.
So I guess the start of everything for me was when I was in my undergrad. I attended Penn State University, and I had not the best idea of what I wanted to do, but I was on the powerlifting team at the time, so I had been training, and we had a fairly good powerlifting coach that had a good background, mainly using the Shiko method as the main way of training. And then I'd happened to take a class with Dr. Zadiorsky, so one of the pioneers of developing strength programs, and he had quite a bit of knowledge of weightlifting. And so that was my first real experience with a program that would be working with athletes. And so that kind of gained my interest and kind of gave me a direction going forward. So after I graduated from Penn State, I got into weightlifting, and I found a weightlifting coach. And luckily, I had a very high-level weightlifting coach living near me, about a half an hour away. So I went and started training with Leo Totten. So he is the head coach, East Coast Gold, still my current coach now. And that's kind of how I got involved in the weightlifting scene. So I was training, I completed my master's, and I was kind of going up through weightlifting, and I wanted to get into coaching and then further my education. I found out about East Tennessee State with Dr. Stone. So Leo had known Dr. Stone for a long time, and my other coach, his name is Doug Lentz, he also knew Doc and Meg very well. So I got in contact with them, got accepted in the PhD program, and then I traveled down to Tennessee to work on my doctorate. So while I was down there, I worked with the weightlifting team, and I coached weightlifting down there at the Olympic training site. And then I also had the pleasure to work with Dr. DeWeese. So I got to watch him coach full-time in his application of training methods for bobsledders and some high-level Olympians. So I got a really nice experience of weightlifting as well as other high-level coaching methods and how to apply science and training together. So once I graduated, I finished up my doctorate. I got my job here at Sacred Heart, and so I teach all the strength conditioning classes here. And then at the beginning of this year, the head weightlifting coach of the team here at Sacred Heart stepped away due to family demands, and I took over here. So in addition to my teaching responsibilities, I'm also the head coach of the Sacred Heart weightlifting team.
That is quite the introduction to strength and strength sports. Some big names there, and I'll be really interested in hearing how they've influenced the way you go about training and programming for athletes. So I like to do kind of a thought experiment. Say we have an athlete walk into the gym. What's your approach to developing a program for the weightlifter? And maybe if you can point us towards some useful resources that have kind of helped guide the way you approach developing strength and power for athletes.
So if we're just going to specifically talk about a weightlifter, their program might be substantially different than just a regular athlete. So if we consider a weightlifter first, I definitely want to bring them into the gym and sit down and talk with them for a little bit first to find out about their background. Find out how long they've been training, what their background of training was prior to them coming to the gym. It's quite different if you've had someone that's never been on a barbell before, but has done other sports. compared to someone that's been barbell training for a while, and then finding out what type of base they have. Do they have a work capacity base? Do they have those standard movement qualities that you look for from athletes that had like a multi-purpose background? So then you know what to throw at them. And then after that, I like to get them on the barbell, see what they can do, look at their flexibility. If they've been training for a while, usually they can hit pretty good positions. But if they're brand new, just transitioning over, finding some of those deep positions in the squat and clean can be difficult. So I want to find out where they are flexibility-wise and then go from there. And obviously the background talk, you talk about their numbers, their strengths and weaknesses, find out what is the most important quality to focus on at the time that's going to make them better. Some athletes come in with a high strength base, but low technical base, and some are the exact opposite. They might just not be strong. So ultimately, the program is going to be dictated by what they need at that moment to progress them forward. Whatever that bottleneck that's causing them to not get better, we want to attack that with the best exercises or the best training plan.
Okay, and I'm familiar with the style of programming they kind of use out of ETSU. So do you take more of like a block kind of approach to it?
I do take a block approach, and I tend to go more with a weekly undulating plan so that the intensities change across the weeks, but I tend to keep the sets and reps similar across the blocks. So, farther out from competition, we're going to handle more volume, multiple exercises to try and fix technique, and we'll probably focus more on general qualities. So that's the time when you can push the squats and the pulls, get in those exercises that might be complexes to build up a work capacity. And then as you start approaching competition, the weights are going to get heavier, the repetitions are going to drop, and you have to begin to focus more exclusively on the lifts that you're going to do in competition. So we'll start to remove some of the complexes. We'll start to push the squats with lower repetition amounts, but higher intensity. And then we start to back off on the lifts and start doing singles and doubles and more of the competition style lifts. And then depending on where they are, if we're going to go through a peaking phase, we'll obviously get them close to the meet, pull all the fatigue off of them, and then try and solidify the technique at the time to be as fast and as sharp and technically proficient as we can before the meet.
Okay, so assuming our audience is looking at weightlifting programming, there are certain principles you kind of have to adhere to, and as you've kind of laid out your method of taking an athlete from far out of competition to the meet, you adhere to those principles. So if you can kind of explain the importance of each one and how an athlete can understand if it's being used correctly within a program, because there are so many free ones on the internet, I'm sure it's hard to differentiate between what's a good training plan and what isn't.
So it's a pretty involved question, but if you consider the main principles of periodization, which are specificity, variation, reversibility, all of these are really important in the plan. So far out from a meet, you can do more repetition with more variety of exercises. So these are things where you combine lifts together, like power snatches, overhead squats, clean front squat plus jerk. All of those are great for building up capacity and working on more general qualities. And then as you approach competition, you also have to remember that you need to be very specific to what you're going to do on the day of the meet. So the heaviest weights are your end goal in competition. So you want to have the best technique and lift the most amount of weight that you possibly can. So you're probably going to have to lift heavier weights closer to the meet. And so when you're looking at plans, you want to make sure that they follow these natural progressions. You're not doing the same types of lifting all year round. If they have you maxing out week number 1 after you've just finished out doing a meet, it might not be the best plan for working on technical aspects. So you definitely want to have times of more volume where you can focus on technique with some lighter weights. And then you definitely want to have times where you peak and you can work on those qualities under competition-like settings. You also have to remember that all the fitness qualities that you develop in the gym, don't return to baseline at the same time. So certain qualities that you build will stick around longer than others. So you know what to emphasize at right times. Your speed and power definitely return to baseline more quickly. So you're going to have to revisit those qualities more often. Whereas your maximal strength sticks around a little bit longer. So you probably don't need to be doing really heavy deadlifts or really maximal type heavy squatting the week of the meet. You could probably do it the weeks leading up and then leave that out of, the last few days from competition, depending on the athlete when you're getting ready. So being able to know what those variations in the program are will allow you to cater the program more efficiently for each person.
Okay, so if we're looking at developing a peaking plan or a taper, do you have or what do you use as a guide to developing a peak for an athlete? Because obviously you don't want those qualities to diminish completely. You want to try and hit it at the right point so fatigue is diminished, but you're kind of at the peak of your power output or strength level. So can you kind of explain how you approach developing a peaking plan for a weightlifter and maybe give us some guidelines to use?
All right, so depending on the athlete, so obviously the smaller the athlete at the lighter the weight class, the more quickly that they can recover. And that's really due to the absolute loading on the bar. So you're loading for a 48 kilo female as opposed to a 75 might be different, which means that they can probably lift heavier weights closer to the meet compared to some of the heavier classes. So once you consider that, you also need to know that for a taper to work effectively, you want to maintain or slightly elevate the intensity leading up to the meet while dropping off the volume. And when you do this, it allows the athlete to retain their sporting form, feel like they have a good speed and power related to the activities they're doing. And then when the fatigue starts to fall off, that's when they can express the fitness that they built in the gym. So typically, most athletes will max out the snatch and the clean and jerk 10 to 14 days before. Obviously, might be a little bit more for the heavy classes, might be slightly shorter for the light ones. And then we just bring the volume off while maintaining the intensity at a fairly high level. So we won't necessarily max out, 2 or 3 days before the meet, but you will keep the intensity fairly high. So 80% and above. And then you just change the amounts of sets of the exercises that they're going to do. You might hit some heavy squats during that time, 90% and above, but you might only do 1 or 2 singles with those weights and then back off from there. So it really has to do with the total number of sets that you're performing begins to drop off in that 10 to 14 day period leading up to the meet. And that usually allows people to feel good, move quickly, optimize their strength for that day, but not lose too much strength in the meantime.
Okay. And as far as resources go, if people are looking to get more informed on kind of the research of the ways to peak an athlete and the ways to program for weightlifters, where would you direct them?
So some really good resources that have already been put out. You don't really have to reinvent the wheel, but books by like Greg Everett that tell you all the exercises. He gives you some good information on programming. There's a lot of good information by Bud Charnega about some of the older programs that have been translated over from the Russian systems. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best for American weightlifters, but it's a good resource to kind of understand long-term planning for weightlifters. And that's more of the implementation side, where you're getting into sets and reps and then total volumes across the year. And as people become more qualified, how you need to vary it. And that's all really in the trenches knowledge that you should know. And then if you want to go more on the theoretical side, obviously work done by Dr. Stone, Dr. Hoff on long-term periodization are very important. But also new stuff that's coming out, from Dr. Mujica on tapering and peaking. A lot of that is done on aerobic athletes, but more is starting to come out on strength and power athletes. So Dr. Baszler over at East Tennessee State has done some research on strength and power athletes. So that field definitely needs more research, but more and more is coming out. So I think those are some good places to start, but definitely reading as much as you can around weightlifting, learning the different systems, and learn the multi-year training process. So a lot of stuff, the sets and reps across weeks in the short term is great, but you need to know how to develop a plan over a couple years for people, because weightlifting is not a short-term sport. It takes, a number of years, sometimes 10 or more years for athletes to reach their peak, and you need to know how to build a plan over that long term.
Okay. Now, you kind of alluded to it earlier, but do you feel like there are gaps in our knowledge, and maybe how we would approach filling those going forward?
So I do feel that there are gaps, especially as you approach competition for people that are not necessarily uh, enhanced athletes. So a lot of the research that was done before and that you can read from those large scale weightlifting teams, a lot of those athletes were in a system that developed them from when they were very young to the elite level. And it also doesn't discuss the process of when they would begin administering any performance enhancing drugs. So we need to consider that when we look at plans, and know that the athletes that we're working with today probably cannot handle some of the volumes and some of the intensities that the other countries had been using leading up to competition. So for our athletes who are being tested more regularly, it's getting harder and harder to dope in the current state of weightlifting. So we need to consider that, and we need to run studies on clean athletes and understand how they're going to respond to the training plan. Drugs are great, they work, and there are tremendous effects. If you just look back at old records, you can see that they definitely have a positive effect on weightlifting performance. The lifts done in the 80s and 90s will probably never be achieved again in modern times due to the ability to beat the test before. So if we look at systems that develop those athletes, if you remove the drugs, it's going to be very difficult. So we need to consider that when you're not taking them, you don't recover as quickly. You can't take as many maximal attempts, and you also can't handle the amount of volume. So with that being said, we need to be smarter with our choice of exercises when we build in those heavy repetitions, because they drive adaptation, but we can't use them all the time. So we want to make sure that we're using those windows of opportunities when our athletes are feeling good to really push the lifts, and then control the volume in the long term. Not every year will have the same amount of volume, and we want to make sure that it's in the appropriate amounts to drive the adaptations, but prevents the athletes from getting injured or burn out, and they can peak at the appropriate times.
Okay. So you kind of touched on it. As far as exercise selection goes, do you feel there are any exercises that should be avoided completely? A lot of people are under the assumption that heavy deadlifts for a weightlifter aren't very effective, and obviously it depends on the context. But are there any exercises you particularly shy away from, maybe because the risk isn't worth the reward?
So I would say that there are no exercises in the gym that would not be useful at some point, but I think as long as you build them into the right time period, that would be appropriate. So some people don't use heavy deadlifts because they may feel that it adjusts the motor patterns. The deadlift doesn't look exactly like a clean pull. It's much heavier than a clean. It moves a lot slower. But for an athlete whose pulling capabilities are not very good, a heavy deadlift might be just what they need to understand how to move a heavy weight. And I think if you put them in there early on in a training plan, far out from a meet, build up some back strength, some hypertrophy in the back musculature, some hypertrophy of the traps. It also will help with grip strength. I think that these are very important qualities for weightlifters to build. Now, I would probably cycle out heavy deadlifts as the competition got closer and as they become stronger in the pulls. So we know that your abilities are not static over time, and you may notice that your pulling abilities become better, and then maybe your squatting starts to go down. So if that's the case, we'd put more emphasis on squatting as opposed to deadlifting. So I don't think there's necessarily a bad exercise, and with as many athletes as you work with, one exercise might work for someone really well and it may not work for someone else. So you kind of have to use a trial and error approach with each athlete. Same thing with cueing of those exercises. A cue that someone hears might have a completely different outcome. So you want to be careful removing all exercises from the program because it might be exactly what one weightlifter needs to get better.
Okay. Now, kind of flipping that question, do you think there are any exercises, I mean, obviously squats, push press, deadlifts, that are incredibly useful for most weightlifters that, so the exercises that might be overlooked that when implemented could help correct common technical deficiencies or help, a strength imbalance or something of that nature?
So obviously you have the main classical lifts and their variants, and then you have all the pulling derivatives. So most of those are in every weightlifter's plan. There's hardly a time when you're not going to see any of those in there. And then the same thing with squatting. Most weightlifters know to squat. And then after that, it's really the accessory exercises that people kind of add in and subtract. And that's usually what makes programs a little bit different. And so depending on who your coach was before, really depends on what accessory exercises you build in. So I think things like push press, behind the neck jerks, even strict press farther out from competition can help correct some of the issues that people have. Some other important ones might be like hip belt squats. So the value of building up some of those muscle groups in a slightly different pattern might be important. And then things as simple as doing, seated shoulder press with a barbell. Bench press can be used far out from competition as long as it's not used in excess. And I think that those can all help to develop the muscles around what you need for weightlifting. And then as you approach competition, you start to integrate in more of the classical lifts and try and carry over that new muscle mass and strength into the main lifts. So I think as long as they're intelligently programmed in, any exercise can be used. You probably don't want to use them right before a meet. Probably don't need to do any heavy benches right before a weightlifting competition, as that's not what you're trying to compete in.
Okay, that's interesting. And it kind of reminded me of a question I had. As far as like movement patterns, when we're talking about a heavy snatch grip deadlift, how much of a deviation from the normal snatch can you allow before it starts to interfere with technique? I understand that movement patterns are malleable and it depends how long you've been in the sport. But a lot of people believe that any technique breakdown is going to kind of diminish the usefulness. And then some people believe that you kind of have to push that boundary. So where do you lie in using an exercise that mimics the movement or slightly gets away from the exact mechanics of a snatch?
So it's an interesting question. I think it's one that we don't know entirely the answer to, and it would definitely could use some studies to look at it. But I think 90% of the time, the lifts that you do should try and mimic what you're doing in competition. So if you're doing a snatch grip deadlift, you're trying to build up the musculature and the motor patterns involved in snatching. So most of the lifts probably should look close to snatching. But there's probably some times when you're trying to push the maximal strength envelope where you're going to do a heavy single or a double. Your form might break down a little bit, but that starts to drive the adaptations in the body. So I think if you're doing, over the course of a month, you're stepping up over 3 weeks, your first 2 weeks, you probably should have no technical breakdown. If you say, push it to a high 90% in week 3, there might be a rep or two that don't look 100% like what you would want out of the snatch, but you've pushed the maximal strength and the body's going to adapt to that stimulus. So I think if you keep it close most of the time, and then every so often you push a really heavy lift, you try and keep the technique as close as possible, but when you're trying to get stronger, you have to lift heavy weights, and when you lift heavy weights, sometimes your technique breaks down. So I think that that's acceptable under certain circumstances, but obviously if the lifter is going in and it looks 100% different than the snatch, then you probably want to back away from those. So if they can't keep a consistent back angle, if they can't keep consistent knee angle, if they're rounding or it could potentially cause injury, I think you strip some weight off the bar and and have them do it correct. But if they're on their last repetition and there's a slight technical error, I think occasionally those are okay in attempting to push the strength envelope.
Okay, interesting. Now, as far as developing technique for an athlete, obviously um, there are certain ideals that we look towards. So you want to keep the bar close. You want to have certain angles at the knee and the hip. When you're teaching technique to an athlete, what would you say is similar from athlete to athlete, and what would you say is different?
So similar characteristics in the lift are that the bar should remain close to the lifter throughout the lift. There are very few times and very few people where if the bar starts to travel away from your body, that you can save the lift, especially with the maximal attempt. So things that look similar for all athletes are generally off the floor. The bar needs to stay close to the athlete and travel back over the base of support. Typically, your back is flat and remains flat throughout the whole lift. You can occasionally see people make a lift with a rounded back, but this is an exception to the rule. Most athletes have a back that's locked in. Other characteristics that all athletes will have when you're trying to make a lift is the bar must reach a certain height in the lift, allowing them to have enough time to get underneath. So most athletes, if the bar does not make the correct contact with the hip, wherever it is for that athlete with their hand grip, more than likely they're going to miss the lift. So you want to make sure that they're hitting the same position on the thigh every time and keeping the bar as close to the lifter as they can in the transition and the drop under the bar. So if you're hitting some of those similar characteristics in the snatch and the clean, you can get into the finer details of errors that they make from there. The snatch and the clean look very similar from the floor to the hip, and it's all the pull under the bar where you begin to see the changes occur, because obviously in the snatch you're going directly over your head. But for the most part, the pull is going to look fairly similar between the two, and then you'll be able to correct those issues for the athlete when they arise.
Okay, and looking at a few of the finer details, the arms in the clean, some people say that a natural bend can occur. Some people coach straighter arms. Where do you kind of lie on that spectrum?
So anytime that there's a break in the kinetic chain, so if in this case you're talking about bending your arms, you're shifting the weight from the straight arm where it's hanging on the musculature, and then you begin to put it into the bicep musculature and in the upper back. So in the lifts, they're all a leg exercise, and then your back is working isometrically, mainly from the floor. So as you're driving, you're trying to impart all of that weight from the legs into the barbell. So you want the arms hanging as straight as possible. Some people try and drag the bar into the hip to get a slightly higher contact. But what you find with intermediate lifters is it tends to slow the bar down, even though they think they're moving faster. And that tends to lose a couple kilos, and some athletes tend to not finish their pull. So for me, I like to have athletes keep their arms as straight as possible until they finish the second pull and begin dropping under the bar. So the straighter you can keep the arms, the more force you can transfer from your legs into the barbell through the hands, and the more forceful your second pull will become. And so obviously some elite athletes get away with some technical breakdown, but they're elite. So those small variations in their technique allow them to lift the most amount of weight, but we probably don't want to take those small nuances of an elite lifter and put them into our intermediate and beginner lifters. So coach for the ideal first, and then as someone progresses over time, small variations in technique will arise, and that's okay because that's going to allow them to lift the most amount of weight. And that's what we tend to see with those elite lifters. They're really good, they have excellent technique, and there's small adjustments that allow them to do more weight and then win. But we probably don't want to do that developing all weightlifters across the board.
Out of personal curiosity, I've noticed for myself that when I do activate the back, off of the floor, my elbows tend to break. I'm kind of interested in hearing your thoughts. I've talked to a coach about this. I've kind of talk to lifters about this, but from someone that's had an extensive education in it, I would like to hear your opinion.
So you're saying that as you lock your back in,
Yeah.
that your arms start to bend a little bit?
Yeah.
So for you, I watched a couple of your videos of your lifting, and you tend to have longer arms in relation to your height. So depending on where you put your arms on the bar, especially in the clean, if you have a very narrow hand grip, it may cause you to bend the arms early in response to that, more of your anthropometrics compared to your technique. But it seems that when you lift, you still get the bar into the same place every time. So it may be a function of your arm length as opposed to a technical issue. And it could be as simple for some athletes as moving your hands slightly out in the clean and using a slightly wider grip allows them to keep their arms a little bit straighter in the pull. Because if they have their arms in really close, they may try and row the bar into the hip, causing that really aggressive arm bend that we try and avoid. So it could really just be on an athlete's build. And then the cueing that you give them, pushing with the legs, letting your arms hang, and trying to roll the hands under from the start are some things that people can do to try and not use the arms as much.
Okay. Now, as far as the pull under goes, do you coach? And these are kind of like this might be something that's individual, but do you coach to keep a full grip on the bar or work towards keeping a full grip on the bar as you pull under in the clean? Or is it just kind of whatever the athlete can do as long as you're maintaining contact and the bar's not dropping substantially?
Yes, it's going to be highly individual for the athlete. So some athletes have a long forearm in relation to their upper arm, and it may be harder for them to keep a full grip. So that might be a time when catching with that open palm grip on the way down might be appropriate. But if you have the flexibility, it's not causing pain, a full grip on the bar is going to be the optimal way to receive the bar on the deltoids as you're going under. And then when you stand up, you don't have to waste any energy re-gripping, re-racking the weight. You can stand up, go ahead and get set for the jerk, and then go. There's quite a bit of variation when you look across athletes. Some athletes use a full open grip. The bar's just sitting in their fingertips, and then they close their hand when they do the jerk from there, and it seems to not affect them at all. So I think for your beginner athletes, when you're teaching them to front squat or you're teaching them to clean, trying to get them to the full grip is going to be the best way to go from an efficiency standpoint. And obviously, if your arms are very long or you have some different forearm lengths, you're going to have to teach that open grip catch because that's the only way they'll be able to receive it.
Okay, so when we're looking at correcting something that can be considered a technical fault, would you go the route of using exercises to try and improve that fault, or would you focus more on using cues first and then transitioning? And the only reason I bring that up is because I've talked to coaches that have a differing stance on this. Some people prefer exercises that correct the deficiency. Some people prefer sticking to the snatch and the clean and jerk, the competition style snatch and clean and jerk, and then just using verbal cues or trying to kind of coax the athlete into lifting correctly. So what's your approach to this?
So I think the first step is to try and verbally correct the cue, because it could simply be that the athlete is just thinking incorrectly about the exercise. So they're attempting to do something, they might not simply know that they're doing it wrong. And different cues may elicit different responses. So I think at first, when you see a technical issue, it could just be on that rep or that series of reps that day. So trying to fix it verbally first and see what feedback you can gain from the athlete. Then once their technique is solidified and in the long term you start watching what their competition lifts look like, you start to look what more of the overall technical issues are, that might be the time to begin to build in specific exercises to correct that technique. Because over time, once your technique is solid, you will find that the athlete commits the same errors all the time, and that's when you use those special exercises to try and fix it. You may notice an athlete looks really good off the floor until they get to their maximal attempts. So you may then need to adjust the special exercises to build up off the floor strength to carry over to the lifts. The other thing to consider is that your technique is not a static entity and will train as you train and you get stronger, your technique will adjust with those heavier weights. So the weight that you're handling now, your technique will be different when you get to the heavier weights. So you may need to put some remedial exercises in later as they become stronger and as their technique develops, because the technique used with 60 kilos is going to be a lot different than 160.
Right, and obviously the SRA curve for technique is much shorter, so you'd want to ideally perform an exercise more frequently. What's your approach to programming in the snatch, clean, and jerk? Do you think, and a lot of people talk about systems, so like a Bulgarian system or a Russian system. The Bulgarians were known for training very frequently, which I'm sure could be useful for, I guess, keeping whatever technique the athlete has and not allowing there to be drastic fluctuations. And it's going to change depending on the distance out from a competition. But as far as how you program in the snatch and clean and jerk, do you have one of those movements every training day? Do you tend to do it once every other day? What are your thoughts on that?
So for most of the athletes in their development, we will do a lift or a variation of the lift to start every workout. And for those athletes, we'll do a power snatch, could be power clean, power jerk, or it could be a full lift, and they're found throughout the program. And so typically the way we adjust them is by adjusting the intensity of the lifts so that you can still perform the lifts, feel comfortable, and then you build in other variations like the power variations to try and work on some different effects. So you have to pull the bar higher in the clean and the snatch. You're going to use less weight. So that might be a way to modulate the intensity as opposed to always going heavy in the full lifts. Now, for certain athletes, if they have an extreme strength deficiency where they're highly efficient technically, but what's holding them back is actually their strength, we may drop the number of days down per week to devote more energy to squatting and pulling. So in that case, if they were working out 3 to 5 days a week, 3 days might be the lifts and their variations, and the other 2 might be just devoted to squatting and pulling so that they can put all of their energy into those lifts and try and drive those adaptations. But as they approach competition, you're going to have to build in more of those full lifts again and then back off the squatting and the pulling. So anytime you're peaking for competition, you're definitely going to be at a higher frequency of the lifts and at a higher intensity. And then we use the off season after a meet to really get away from the main lifts and focus on whatever their weakness might be.
So what sort of fluctuations would we look at as far as maybe having a heavier day for the snatch and then the clean and jerk, and then the next day would be a lighter day? Are we looking at dropping a certain percentage? So say maybe we're working at 90% of a snatch, the next day we're working at 70%, and then it goes back to 90, 70, something like that.
Yeah, that might be one way to do it. I tend to fluctuate across the weeks. So week 1 might be at 80, week 2 might be at 85%, and then we try and keep it similar for all of the exercises. So, Monday you might hit all your snatches at 80%, and then you might hit all your cleans at 80% on Wednesday. And same thing with power snatches. And then because the power snatch is going to be lighter, some of those days can serve as recovery days. So the athlete still feels like they're lifting fairly heavy, but the absolute load on the bar is actually less. So they're not going to be taxed as much. So the athlete still feels like they're moving a heavy weight, but you kind of build that in as a recovery day. And then as you go across the weeks, you kind of build up and you can lift some heavier weights in that whole week. And typically, whatever your weakness is focused on early in the week compared to later. So if you're bad at clean and jerks or not as efficient, we might put those on Monday and Tuesday because you have more energy at that time. And then if you're fairly proficient at snatching, we might put those heavier lifts later in the week because they're not as high of a focus. And so once you come off the weekend, most people usually eat enough food. They're more well rested. We can devote the most amount of training energy to the lifts that you need most improvement in.
Do you have a preference for implementing accessory exercises? So on a day when you snatch, maybe adding in other overhead work, and then on a day when you clean, adding in pulls. I know certain coaches like to bias days to overhead or pulling strength or squatting strength.
So depending on how many days a week that someone may be lifting, I like to pair the classical lifts with a pull in the same grip. So if you do a snatch, you would perform snatch pulls afterwards, trying to overload the movement with the same motor pattern. So typically, when we'll add 5 to 10 kilos to whatever your best snatch is or clean and jerk, and then you base the pulls off that number. So you're working on speed, you're working on timing, and it's going to look quite similar to what you just did. And then squatting is really dictated by how well the athlete can recover. Most athletes will squat 2 to 3 times a week, and we try and put them through the week where they can have enough recovery, because heavy back squats are fairly taxing. So we might put those on a day when we know that the next day is an off day. So if you know they're lifting Monday and Tuesday, but Wednesday they have off, we might back squat on Tuesday, just knowing that they're going to have a full day to recover from those squats before they would initiate lifts on, let's say, Thursday. And then again, if their back squat is really good in relation to their front squat, we might put the front squat earlier in the week, because we want them to focus on being better at front squatting, and then more of a retaining load for the back squat later in the week, because we know that that strength is already there.
Okay. And going back to the frequency, I've been talking to a pretty high-level coach, and he's interested in running a high-frequency program. Now, with your totality of knowledge, would you say that having an intermediate weightlifter in the United States following a very high-frequency program, say 14 workouts, snatch, clean and jerk, obviously singles at a higher percentage, and then front squat, single, high percentage, sort of like a Bulgarian style. Do you think that would be effective? And if there would be any benefit, could you list them out, and then what the detriment would also be?
So could it work with the right individual? I definitely think it could. This person would have to have optimal situations, so living close to the gym, having enough time, having enough food, having some support system with them. So having all of those are probably the first things you need to consider. So they probably shouldn't be in school. They probably can't have a full-time job, or it can't be a very stressful job where they're on their feet a lot. They probably need to have an optimal diet and enough rest where they can lift this many times per week. You can't really be rushing around and trying to get 14 sessions in. So they would need dedicated training time, and then they would need a coach with them at all times on their heavy lifts. So it wouldn't be something that I would trust someone with to go in and lift by themselves on those days. Someone would have to be present to make those training calls as the system went. If all of those things are in place, you would also have to find the right individual with the proper genetics to be able to recover from that type of program. Some athletes do better with high frequency, but you also have to consider the total volume within the week. So even though you're doing more lifts and you're spreading them out, you can't always increase the volume exponentially over time, because there's only so much volume that humans can recover from. So even though you're dividing it up into the sessions, you will want to try and understand what the total weekly volume would be, and understand that if certain workouts you push above and beyond what you had intended for that day, you may have to remove some volume from later in the week. And it's going to have a recovery cost associated with lifting that heavy all the time. So they're going to have to spend a lot of time using restoration methods, trying to get back to baseline and trying to recover. Because it's not simply enough just to get back what you lost. We also need to have that adaptation period where you go above and beyond what you did. And so if you're constantly lifting and just replacing what you lost and getting back to zero, it's not actually going to make you better in the long term. You need to apply the stimulus, go home and rest, and allow your body to adapt from that stimulus. So I think it would take some excellent coach and athlete interaction and an optimal environment at the time for that system to work. I think that it is possible for someone to do it, but most athletes probably could not handle that demand in the long term. Maybe for a short-term training cycle, most athletes would be okay, but in the order of a couple months, some people would fall apart. Not many people could handle those demands.
Okay, so taking just a 6-day-a-week program with one training session a day, do you think it would be more beneficial to take that training session and break it up into 3 separate sessions? Because obviously when you start lifting, you can only maintain a certain quality for such an extended amount of time. So taking a similar volume and breaking up into more frequent training sessions, for someone who obviously has the time, would that be beneficial? And what length of a session would we be looking for to kind of optimize what we can get out of it?
So I think if you have the time and it doesn't put an undue burden on your recovery, then splitting the same session, let's say 4 exercises that you would do in a given day, into 2 separate sessions would provide more high quality work in those 2 sessions than if you tried to do all of it at once. Because you could imagine if you did 4 exercises, could take hour and a half, 2 hours possibly to complete that whole session. If you split it up into 2 individual hour sessions, you're going to get better quality work. There's also some research that shows that the first session in the day will potentiate later sessions in the day. So if you lift in the morning, you've already warmed up, the nervous system is affected throughout the day, your second session might actually be benefited by performing that session earlier in the day. Now, there is some debate on what would be better in terms of exercises, where if you did the strength exercises in the morning and then the full lifts at night, or vice versa. But you may want to consider that you're fresher when you first wake up and you have no training. So if you want to focus on technique, you might want to do that first. And then the strength lifts don't have as much of a technical demand, so you might be able to put them later in the day. But some athletes have found pretty good success squatting in the morning and then doing the lifts at night because they already feel warmed up, nervous system was stimulated from the morning, and they feel a little bit more aggressive in the afternoon. That might work for certain people. So I think there's some individual differences for people, but anytime you can, dividing them up is a good way to go. If you can separate them by 4 to 5 hours to allow you to get enough food in, get enough rest, you're going to have quality sessions. And then there is an effect of performing skill work in the morning and then taking a nap after you perform the skill work. So there is some consolidation of motor patterns when you sleep. That's when you tend to sort out what you've done. And so if you could perform the full lifts in the morning, eat, take a nap, wake up, and then perform your later session, that may in the long term yield additional benefits from the consolidation of those motor patterns. So those might all be some benefits of the dual training sessions in a day, along with the higher quality work that you could perform in each session.
Okay, very interesting. So if we were looking for like an optimal length of a session, what would you recommend? Because obviously training for 3 hours is going to end up yielding very little benefit towards the end. I've heard from Dr. Stone like 45 minutes and then your rate of force development starts to decline. How long are your sessions with your athletes typically?
So typically, we try and keep them to around an hour. So I'm always going to defer to Dr. Stone when he has a statement like that. But typically, if you're lifting fairly heavy weights, after the hour mark, it begins to fall off a little bit, unless you're taking large breaks in between the exercises. So I think that limiting your workouts to 45 minutes to an hour, if you can, would be appropriate in trying to maintain those force and power outputs across the session. Now, if your athlete doesn't have enough time, they've only got one time block a day, then you're going to have to get that whole session in that time. But if you're working with high-level lifters and they're really making a commitment to training, dividing those 2 or 3 sessions a day into smaller time increments will be better for them in the long run due to managing the fatigue from those sessions and being able to put more effort in to those later exercises. So I think that's where I would call it, if you can divide it into later sessions, is trying to get them to be no more than an hour at a time. And if you need to, divide it into 3 a day if you need it. If you had to train for 3 hours or needed to get that much volume in, 3 sessions would be better than one large one.
Sure, that has to be tough to hear for most people because, I mean, a lot of people spend about 2 hours to 3 hours at the gym, partially because they're not serious athletes. It's more of like a social thing as well. So no knock to them. It's kind of funny. But as far as maintaining that length of a session, I'm sure if you want to get quality work in, rest periods have to be shorter. So when you're resting for an exercise between sets and then between exercises, what do you think is optimal and what would you recommend?
So they have done some research on rest periods, and they've found that the typical rest period is about 3 to 5 minutes for strength work, and that shorter rest periods probably don't confer additional benefits because they used to think previously that short rest periods would have an acute hormonal effect where you get more growth hormone and testosterone release by doing really short rest periods like 30 seconds to a minute. And they haven't shown in the long term for that to be as effective. So because of the technical demands and the strength demands of our sport, probably 3 to 5 minutes is optimal most of the time. And then between exercises, as much time as you need to recover, 5 minutes is usually the standard. But if you have the time and you can take 5 to 10 minutes in between, kind of sit down, let everything return to baseline, let your heart rate fall back to baseline, and then resume your next exercise, you're going to have a higher quality of the exercise. Now, if you're doing 5 exercises a day, you obviously can't take 10 minutes in between each. That would serve as an hour of rest, so you might have to keep those shorter. But if you're only doing 2 or 3 exercises in a session, 5 to 10 minute break in between would probably be sufficient. The only time I might make alterations to this are in the pre-competition period when you're preparing someone for a meet and you want to get them closer to the demands that they would have in competition. So you never know what could happen in a meet. You could get rushed for an attempt. Someone could bump up, and you may only have a minute or 2 to recover. That might be a time where you may introduce some 2-minute rest periods where they have to lift some fairly heavy weights before the meet with incomplete rest. Because we know that it takes a few minutes for your ATP to resynthesize. It takes about 7 minutes to 10 minutes for full restoration of the CP system. So that might be appropriate when you're trying to maximize your strength, but you'll know in a meet that you may not always have 7 minutes of rest in between your snatches. You may want to shorten some rest periods to try and challenge the athlete so they don't feel rushed on the day of competition. Because if you're always taking these really long breaks and then you're asked to take an attempt every 3 minutes getting ready for the meet, they may feel rushed and their heart rate might be elevated at that time because they're not used to moving at that speed. So providing them with some simulation of what the day's loading attempts might be helps people not feel out of the element on the day of the meet.
Excellent. And this is kind of an aside, but I know there are a lot of people that are proponents of EMAR, so every minute training, and I've kind of experienced this myself and heard that it helps with developing technique kind of as the time period goes on. Do you have any maybe explanation for why 15 snatches on the minute would be beneficial to developing technique as your lifting goes on versus just 15 singles with longer rest periods?
So as long as you've lowered the intensity enough, these could be appropriate at certain times. And what you're essentially doing is limiting the amount of resynthesis of ATP in between the lifts. So as that set extends and goes longer, it's going to be more technically demanding on the lifter because their force outputs is going to have to be maintained, but it's probably going to lose other aspects. So you may have more qualities coming from force as opposed to velocity. And it's also going to be mentally more challenging because as they go, their technique's going to slightly alter as they go, and they're going to have to focus more to be able to hit those lifts. So I definitely think that it can be integrated into a plan at the right times as a challenge for the athlete, or maybe to get them to have incomplete restoration in between lifts to know what that feels like. But also, you're not always going to be training when you're not tired. So this might be a time to see where their technique breaks down when they start to get tired, so that you know what that athlete's weaknesses might be. So reps 10 through 15 are probably going to look a lot different than 1 through 5. And then you kind of see where the athlete is mentally in those sets as well. As it drags on, do they get more excited? They become more determined, or some athletes become defeated from this long term because they notice their technique starts to fall? You can kind of get a glimpse into what your athlete's, mental outlook on those sets is. And so it can probably give you not only physiological feedback, but also some feedback from what your athlete's strengths and weaknesses are mentally. So I think it'd be a good tool.
I never really considered that. That's actually very interesting to hear. Instead of having to go heavy and see where the technique breaks down, just put them under a lot of fatigue because of the time constraint instead. So the last kind of part I'd like to touch on before we get to the wrap-up portion of it is recovery. And the only reason I really want to touch on this is because I've been hit with a lot of people telling me that they're, incredibly beat up and then they hit a PR. Now, as far as optimizing recovery, what can we do outside of the gym? And I guess I'll just save the next portion of the question for after you answer it. But obviously we have sleep, so maybe what would be an optimal amount, and then we have food, so at least eating to maintenance or in a surplus. But as far as sleep goes, how much should we be looking to get each night?
So sleep, most important thing that you can do, but it's also the quality of the sleep that you get is really important. A study came out recently that showed that athletes that bumped their sleep up from 8 hours to a little over 9 hours got better effects in the short term compared to the people that didn't. And they've also done a study where they showed that the less hours that you sleep per night, the more likely you are to get injured. So you want to get enough quality sleep in, and then if you can throughout the day, take naps to try and make up for any deficiencies that you have in sleep. Things come up in life, you only get 6-7 hours of sleep a day. If you can take a nap midday, that would be ideal. You just have to be careful when napping that you don't sleep too long, or you tend to get sleep inertia. So you either sleep less than 30 minutes or a full 90, because a full 90 minutes is a full sleep cycle. So if you can get a full 90 in, that's perfect. If you can only get 30 in, try and do that midday, and that usually makes people feel better. You can also try and adjust the conditions in your room, get blackout shades, no electronics an hour before you go to bed, sleep in a cool environment, make it quiet. Some people like to get noise reducing devices if they live in an area where there's a lot of noise. Some people live in a college dorm, and obviously it's not an optimal environment to sleep in when you have a roommate, so maybe getting a noise canceling device might help for some of the collegiate athletes. Those are all good things to do. And then we'll probably talk about diet, but they have done some studies that have shown that casein protein before bed, just as one of the only things that people change, made a longer, more important impact over time, where athletes gained more lean body mass and didn't gain as much fat mass and recovered better over time, taking a casein shake before bed. So those are all things you can do sleep-wise to help you get a little bit better recovery that way. And then from the diet, you already said the most important thing. Hitting your calories, making sure that you're getting enough calories in per day is going to be the most important and most critical factor in your recovery. You want to try and eat in a surplus, and you want to make sure that you're eating at least maintenance, especially when you have high volumes, because you want to eat enough total calories to sustain what you're burning per day. And so that's the most important factor.
Now, do you think it's a matter of more is better for both sleep and food? So obviously, you'd want to hit a minimum amount of both. But if you're eating in a surplus and then sleeping maybe 10 hours a night, would that be more beneficial, or does it get to a point where there's diminishing returns?
So for sleep, most people don't sleep enough. So I'd probably tell my athletes whenever you can sleep. Whenever you have a chance to sit down, definitely sit down. If you have a chance to lay down, just lay down. And then if you can sleep, you might as well sleep to help recover, because most people don't. When it comes to food, we have unique demands in weightlifting because we're a weight class sport. So yes, you need enough food to fuel your training and your recovery. But most athletes, if you're near the top of your weight class, you cannot eat in a surplus all the time, or you'll travel into the next weight class up. So that makes our sport fairly difficult. If you're trying to be competitive nationally, your body weight's kind of stabilized. You have to have a pretty good handle on when you can gain weight and when you can't. There has been some research that has shown that if you're quite big difference above your weight class, more than 3% about a month out from the meet, trying to make weight usually has negative effects on your performance. So you want to try and be no more than 1 to 1.5% over your weight class in about the 4 weeks leading up to the meet. There's some pretty good research that shows that your leg musculature can lose size when you're in a deficit leading up to the meet. And leg size is one indicator of performance. You want to try and keep that muscle mass that you built as much as you can. So if you're in a pretty extreme deficit, you're not eating enough food, you're going to begin losing lean body mass and fat mass at the same time. So you want to try and be as close to your weight class as you can. And then in the 4 weeks out, you want to try and only be about 1.5 to 2% maybe over your weight class, and then slowly come down for the meet. And obviously, the larger the weight class, the more weight you can cut without it affecting your performance. So your 48, 56 men and women, they're probably going to have to be about 0.5%, maybe max over. Whereas your 105 and your 90 class, you can probably be a little bit higher above that and not have any negative effects. So it really depends on the class as well when we start to look at nutrition.
So obviously, sleep and diet are non-negotiable, but for other recovery modalities, I understand that to an extent it's whatever works, and it really doesn't necessarily matter why. But what are your go-to recovery modalities? And what are your thoughts on the idea that placebo or not, if there's an improvement, continue doing it?
So there are some where I would say, if you feel better, go ahead and do it, but some will require special considerations. So some things that have not been proven in the research to work are things like massage. Mm-hmm. But if you ask anyone that gets a massage, do you feel better after you get it done? Most people say yes. So in that case, you'd probably want them to get a massage done just from the mental benefits alone of feeling better. Even if physiologically it didn't really change that much, a lot of people feel better, so you might as well do it. There are other things that, like specifically I would mention ice baths that have become more popular, or cryo chambers. People use those more often than maybe they should at the wrong times of the year. During the off season, or if you're in a hypertrophy block, you're trying to get larger, put on lean body mass. If you use cryo chambers or cold tubs, they have shown that it tends to negatively impact hypertrophy gains in the long term. So you may want to limit those and only use them in the pre-competition phase. When you're lifting really heavy and you need to be sharp for many training sessions leading up to a meet, that might be the best time to do them. And then leave them out of those high volume phases when you're looking for structural adaptations. Your athletes are going to feel bad, and that's probably okay. You're just going to have to talk them through it, and they're going to be sore. But some of that is necessary to get those adaptations, especially for hypertrophy. So even though they're feeling kind of rough, you may want to try and use other recovery items to help them feel better, and then stay away from the cold baths, just as one specific example that I seem to see a lot of people using now, is just jumping right in the cold tub after every session. Mm-hmm. And it may negatively affect some of the longer term adaptations that you're looking for.
So as far as diagnosing recovery, and if an athlete is recovered enough, would you say that performance is probably the strongest indicator?
Yeah, performance is probably the best way to tell. And then also, if athletes tell you that they don't feel good multiple days in a row, obviously there's times in training where in a sport you're going to feel like crap. The heavier you lift, the more qualified you become. There are certain times where it doesn't matter. 200 kilos is 200 kilos. It's going to feel terrible when you lift. You just got to get through it. But if it's for a long time, they never feel like they're recovering, that's when you may need to get a gauge on what are some additional items we might need to use at the time to get you back to normal. So E-stim makes some people feel better. There is limited evidence on that currently, but more is coming out. Some people like to use cupping. Some people like to use massage, self-myofascial release, all of those things, foam rolling. And as long as it's not doing any harm, then it makes them feel better. They can probably do those things as long as it's not going to have any long-term negative effects. And so you have to know at certain times of the year when you should feel bad, and then when are times when you should be feeling pretty sharp. You shouldn't be feeling incredibly beat up the days leading up to a meet. And so you may know that those are things that you should try and avoid. You may also want to try and get some performance metrics from your athletes if you have the ability, vertical jumps, if you have access to any measurement devices. That might be a way to tell if they're recovering sufficiently, because we know that after heavy sessions, your jumps tend to go down. So if you can find a time when you can get some vertical jumps in, maybe on a weekly basis, you might be able to tell if athletes are recovering enough in between, even if their lifts look fairly good. They aren't always the first thing that's affected.
So with the vertical jump, I've kind of heard that it depends on how aroused the athlete is beforehand. So it can kind of be influenced by that, but I could see like velocity-based training or using some sort of like Tendo unit is a pretty consistent indicator. Would you recommend that people try to measure their bar speed if they have access to the device, or do you think it'd be useful?
I think for some lifts, it may be useful. Weightlifters, if you have the ability to put it on the snatch and the clean, you'd want to look for a peak velocity in terms of the lift, and then you'd have to pick a weight that they handle all the time to kind of see how it's moving. But you did bring up a very valid point that arousal at the time is really important. So if someone's really sluggish or they're not motivated that day, they're going to move a weight slow even though they're recovered. So you really need to have the athlete move with maximal intent. So telling them, I need you to try and move this weight as fast as you possibly can during the attempt. Because obviously if you go in and you lift 60 kilos, you can mess around and still make the weight. It's not with maximal intent. So you really want to cue them to perform this to the best of their ability every time. And then if you're doing it on a fairly regular basis, like at least once a week, they become more familiar with the testing process, and then they tend to give you more consistent results. So if you're doing it like every Monday, when you're warming up, you're doing snatches, we have this device on there and measuring it, and they're using maximal intent, that would be a valid metric then to determine if they're recovering or not. The other important thing with the velocity-based training is that you consider each athlete on an individual basis. So you wouldn't want to say athlete A and B are moving at the same speed, because they're going to be quite different on the force velocity profile. So you'd want to make sure that each of them is considered independent of each other when you're looking at those bar speeds across the weeks.
Okay, that's very interesting. Now, for people that don't have access to equipment, obviously a vertical jump would be useful. What about like a questionnaire, like self-assessment, or heart rate variability? I'm not sure if you looked at the literature on that. What are your thoughts on that as far as diagnosing how properly the athlete is recovered?
So questionnaires have a fair bit of data behind them, showing that they are a valid metric for gauging recovery. and they're fairly easy to administer now. You can do things as simple as a Google Docs sheet that goes to their cell phone. They can fill it out and report to you how they're feeling. So that might be an easy way for a coach to get a subjective measure. And some athletes will be consistent over time, and then something will happen, and then a red flag will pop up. They're always average. They put 7s every day. Everything's good. And then they put like a 4 one day. Well, that athlete's a little bit lower today. Now you can have a conversation with them. Hey, I noticed that your questionnaire came up and you said you got a 4 on this metric. What's going on? And just talk to them. They'll be like, well, I had a test. I only got 4 hours of sleep and I sat all day at my desk. So I really feel not great today. Okay, nothing to be alarmed about. But if over the long term you start to see trends, that might be things you could pick out from those questionnaires. I think heart rate's a great one to use because it's easy. You can get free apps on the phone. Everyone has them now. And you just put your finger over the camera button on your phone, and you can get a resting heart rate when you wake up. And the heart rate is related to total training strain. So whether it goes up or down, that might be a valid thing to measure, a metric that you can use over time to see if people are recovering. If you know someone's always at 55, 60 beats a minute, and then they've had a rough week and it's above 70 a lot, large standard deviation, that might be a way to determine someone's not recovering correctly.
All right, interesting. And now as far as from workout to workout, should we be looking for nearly complete recovery? I mean, are we going to see drastic fluctuations in how an athlete feels and how they perform? Like, what sort of change, I guess, should we look for?
So you probably want to consider in the long term across multiple workouts. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't want to make an immediate change based on a day-to-day fluctuation, mm-hmm. as it's probably quite variable. So if you measured someone on Monday to even Tuesday or Wednesday, it could be a fairly large fluctuation, but nothing that would actually be, that would necessitate an alteration in the plan. So you'd be better off looking at a 30-day rolling average and then looking for certain metrics that would jump out that would be outside of, let's say, 2 standard deviations away from that athlete's current mean. And even 1 day or 2 days may not necessitate a change. So that's why you need to look. But if you notice that, all right, we were good for these 4 weeks, now we've changed something, and the last 10 workouts have all been trending in the negative, that might be something that you'd want to get a handle on. Like, why are they getting worse? There are some times when we know they're going to get worse. So you're purposely trying to peak them before a meet. They're lifting really heavy. It's really intense lifts. You would expect them to show some sort of fatigue at that time, and you would expect them to have some decrements. But if you're at a unplanned time in training, when they start to get negative effects for no reason, that might be a cause for concern. So definitely knowing your program and when they are supposed to get worse a little bit, then you would know that you don't really need to change anything.
Okay, and right before we wrap up, I just have one last question. As far as personality goes, do you notice a big difference in an athlete's personality and then how you need to address their training? I've always heard there's sort of a dichotomy. There's like a brick, as Greg Everett puts it, and then a Twinkie. And some people say princesses and warriors, but do you notice that's consistent in like a large group of athletes? And then how do you go about changing the programming for each of them?
So that's probably the most important question that a coach can try to develop is you can't coach every athlete the exact same way. And how you speak to those athletes and how you portray yourself to those athletes is probably very important in their response. There are some athletes where if you give them a challenge, they will rise to that challenge and then they will attempt to beat it. And they're the athletes that you can really push in competition. There's a weight you've been wanting them to hit. They're looking great that day, and you tell them, all right, I loaded your weight on the bar. I need you to go out there and get after it. That athlete will rise to the occasion, and these are your competitors. They're the people that do the best when the pressure is on. There's a big crowd, and they'll rise to the moment and hit that weight. There's other people where if the task is too demanding, they will actually shut down. So they're more of the people that are a little more introverted, and you may need to be a little more conservative.
Mm.
It doesn't mean that their performance won't be there that day, but the jumps that you take, how you speak to them, probably need to be a little bit more conservative going up to their max. They need to feel confident going out there, so you may give them more attempts in the back and then smaller jumps at the top. So they might not get that huge 10-kilo jump at the end to win the meet, but all three of their attempts will be nice and consistent, and they go 6 for 6. So it really depends on that person's psychological makeup as you're working with them, and that's something that you can pick out in training. Some athletes will do everything necessary to make the weight, and sometimes you have to hold them back. And then other people, they're like, well, I don't really feel that great today. And sometimes you just have to load the weight on the bar and make them do it because they can, even though they're kind of backing away from it. And that really depends on personality types. So some people you have to hold back so that they don't max out too often in training. And then the other ones, you actually have to push them. Weightlifting's about lifting the most weight. So you're going to go out there and actually lift that thing.
Right. Do you think it would be useful to maybe for newer athletes implement some sort of personality test? I know there's like the Big Five. Do you think that would be reliable, or is it just kind of you just have to be in the trenches with the athlete, see how they respond to the training, competition atmosphere, all of that?
Yeah, I think a personality assessment might give you some information, but it might not paint the entire picture. And also the training environment that you have and then the competition environment, they can be quite different. So an athlete that loves training and is in the gym doing everything correct, they may present completely different on the day of the competition when they get around other good lifters, never done a meet before, there's some nervous energy there. So I think you need to keep everyone on their own individual scale, and then look over time and see how they change. So you interact with them in training and you interact with them in competition, and then make those small changes that you need for the individual athlete. So, you have introverts, extroverts, those are things that you can pick up from practice, but on the day of the meet, some of those things don't always come out the way you want them to. So I think treat everyone as an individual and make adjustments on the fly.
Oh, it's interesting. And I think a lot of people think of the coach as kind of the static figure, but in reality, you need to adjust to the demands of each athlete, just as the athlete adjusts to the demands of each program. Kind of changing is necessary. So, Chris, thanks for coming on. And like a couple questions just to wrap up that are more oriented towards you as a person, so the listeners can kind of get a feel for who Chris Tabor is as an athlete. As far as training goes, what's the most difficult aspect of it for you, and then for maybe people that you coach?
So for me, the most difficult aspect of training is to trust the process and then not to be wrapped up in the day-to-day variations that occur. If you take everything on a day-to-day basis and you looked at it with a microscope, you would imagine that you're not going to be getting any better. So if you think for these past couple months I haven't hit any PRs, I'm feeling kind of rough, everything hasn't been moving that well, okay, that's a really microscopic view. But if you look across the years from where you started until now, where was I 3 years ago? Oh, I put 30 kilos on my total. That's a pretty good change over those years. So things are moving in a linear upward direction. That's what you want to focus on, is the long-term changes in your performance, not the short-term fluctuations that occur day to day and even month to month. There could be 2-3 month span where things aren't moving as well as you want. That doesn't mean that in the long term you're not getting any better. And then for my athletes, some of the similar things, trusting that it's a long-term process, but also for them, learning and educating them on what weightlifting is about, how it's developed, and telling them why we're building into the plan the things that we do. Some athletes will just go about their business and perform the plan, but others have questions and don't shy away from the questions that the athletes have. Why do we squat this way? Why are you doing the sets and reps this way? And being able to educate them in the long term so that they can buy into the program more fully. they know that you're not just randomly programming for them, that you have a directed goal, and that all of the exercises that you are choosing for them is going to get them better in the end. That you have their, the end goal is to make them the best weightlifter that they can be.
Yeah, I think that's important to inform them that there is an open door policy, and to welcome questions. I think a lot of athletes, they come to you for your service and then they kind of do as they're told. But sometimes they're just not told that asking questions is wanted, or even because I enjoy explaining why we're doing things. You come up with this elaborate training process, and to you it's like almost like your baby, and then you kind of implement it, and then if no one questions you about it and you don't have a chance to talk about it and kind of discuss why you're doing what you're doing, you don't get to share that with people. So that's a great point, Chris. And kind of the last big question we have that I ask every guest that comes on, what is one thing that people can do each day to better their life? So.
Oh, that's a great question and a good one to end on. I think one thing that people can do every day to help them get better is just to be mindful of the present moment. So everyone's always looking forward and rushing towards the future. So they're always trying to get to the next step or the next weight, or they're trying to be the best version of themselves, and they have these 5-year plans. But I think taking a step back and being in that individual moment that day and appreciating everything that you have around you in that moment. And then if you can put all of your energy into focusing on that individual moment over time, that should pay large dividends in your life. So I think that just taking a small step back every day to kind of evaluate where you are and have an appreciation of where you're going is very important.
Yeah, I agree completely. Understanding that this moment potentiates the next, which potentiates the next, and so on and so on. And what you do now will directly result in what happens later is kind of a great philosophy to live by. Now, as far as contact information goes, I don't know if you have one resource you can direct people towards, if there's any projects you're working on, if people can get coaching from you. Anything you have, feel free to give it out now.
Okay, you can find me on the Sacred Heart University website. I'm in the exercise science department. You can find my email on there if people want to send me direct emails. I'm on Instagram. I'm starting up my own company here soon, so we'll have our own Instagram. It'll be popping up. I'll be putting some content on there. But if anyone has any questions about research, they want to reach out to me, or if they have any follow-up questions from what we talked about today, you can find my info there on the website. It's pretty easy. It's just my name, last name, Tabor, C, at sacredheart.edu. And I welcome any questions, comments, or if people want to find me to get some coaching. Coaching over here all the time.
So out of curiosity, what's the business that you're starting up?
So I'm just starting my own sports science consulting company, Human Performance. So we're going to be called Atlas Human Performance. Got everything going, and the website should be live in the next 2-3 weeks, and then we'll be going from there. So one of my colleagues and myself starting that up, and it's going to be mainly for weightlifting, and then any sports science consulting that people would need help with.
Sounds awesome. Can't wait to see it. So thanks again for joining me. I'm sure the audience, the listeners, all the weightlifters and strength athletes are going to be able to find something to glean from this. And guys, if you enjoy the episode, feel free to like, share, subscribe, reach out to Chris with any follow-up questions. And maybe I'll put a post out. If we can get a bunch of listener questions, I know a guy at Revive Stronger, it's another podcast, he has like frequent episodes with Mike Israetel where they kind of do like Q&As. I would love to do that with you, Chris, if we can get enough questions, if you'd be open to it. Because I feel like you're kind of like a hidden resource. I kind of met you on Instagram and Facebook, and then had the opportunity to talk with you today. And I feel like a lot of people can probably get a lot of information from what you have to offer. So,
yeah, I think that's a great idea. We can definitely set up a Q&A or whatever we need to do going forward to help people get some of the answers they need. maybe some more scientific answers if people are looking for those. So that would be good.
Yeah, I think weightlifting is this weird kind of space where we rely on what old coaches have said or what old research has said. But present day scientists are doing just as much as they can to kind of implement some new information and new strategies to improving performance. So that's it, guys. Another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting podcast, and I'll talk to you guys next time.